there. Thank you so much for watching, for listening. Super glad that you're here. Of course, love to have you subscribe. We have great content, and invite your friends to subscribe as well. Share this with your friends. It'd be fantastic. And we're doing a series on starting lessons for starting. Last week we looked at finishing, because we got to finish some things before we can have a fresh start, a fresh launch. But today, and we're looking at three people in the Bible: Jacob, Moses, and Jesus, for these lessons. We looked at how they finished last week, but this week we're going to look at some starting points for each of these gentlemen, so that we can have lessons for ourselves, things that we can apply. So Jacob, I like Jacob. I like him a lot. Again, I said last week, he spans his birth all the way to his death. And we get to walk that whole journey with him and see what he does in his life. But I think it's interesting to look at his starting point, because in many respects, he started from a deficit, or at least that was his thinking. You're like, what do you mean by that? Well, if you remember, when his mom was pregnant with him, she's like, whoo, there's, all kinds of activity, what's going on? And God told her, there's two boys in there, two nations. And there's wrestling, even within the womb, if you will. And who comes out first is Esau, but Jacob is holding on to Esau's heel, and they name him Jacob, deceiver or supplanter, heel grabber. And he comes out, he's the second twin, the younger brother by a couple minutes. And I think in some respects, he maybe started his life from that younger brother mindset, from a deficiency, a deficit. And sometimes I think if we're not careful, the mindset that we have has been shaped from things in our upbringing, from our childhood, and maybe from your birth, where it's like, oh, there's this lack, there's this deficiency, there's this, I have this chasm, this void. And I think it's important for us to think about that, because if that's our mindset, then we bring that into every situation, into every relationship, into every conversation. And that deficit, if we're not careful, it drives us, and it can be more of a driving factor than God being a guiding factor. So if there's deficit thinking in your background, experience, whatever, it's good for you to look at that, because if you're starting and you want a fresh start, you have to consider, is there something in me that would sully or poison or taint a fresh start from some stuff in my background, in my growing up. Another great starting lesson is Moses. I love Moses because, again, he's just a fascinating man, human, that we can relate to. And I like what happens is because when he's 80 years old, he rebounds, in essence, from a false start. So I would propose to you that those first 40 years of his life, he grew up in Pharaoh's household. At the end of that 40 years, he got cranky with an Egyptian slave master, and he killed the slave master. When Pharaoh heard about it, Moses' life was at risk, so Moses ran away into the wilderness. But Moses killed the slave master because he absolutely was angry with that Egyptian slave master for being hard on the Israelite people. Moses identified, I'm an Israelite. This Egyptian slave master is hurting my people, my relatives, and I have to do something about it. And I'm going to step in, and I'm going to intervene, and I'm going to make a difference. I'm going to change the narrative. But he does it in a very violent, hostile, destructive way. And consequently, when he shows up the next day with the Israelite slaves, they say to him, are you going to kill us too? They're not going to follow him because he hasn't earned the honor, the right, and it's not even God's timing. So he had a false start. I think he had a sense of his identity, his purpose, but I think he tried to force it on his own initiative, out of his own gumption, and it was a disaster. But the fantastic thing about Moses is 40 years later, he rebounds from a false start. And maybe you've had some false starts. You started something and it's like, oof, that was in my flesh. It was my natural gumption. But God says, I can still give you a fresh start. And divine participation is always the best way for us to have a fresh start. But even in that divine participation, burning bush, Moses was like, whew, he had some reluctance. I mean, you read those first 3, 5 chapters of Exodus, man, you're going to see some interaction, conversation with God with Moses, where he's wrestling and he's like, well, you know, and I think he's reluctant because he's like, I messed up last time, and what's going to make this time any different? Sometimes when we have a fresh start, we have to be careful that we don't let the past bleed into the fresh beginning that God has for us. And then Jesus, such a great, great example for a fresh start, for a new beginning. And I like what Jesus does, because if you look at his life, I think he had a pretty keen sense of who he was from a very early age. At age 12, he's in the temple teaching the religious leaders. And when Mary and Joseph show up and they're freaked out because they lost him for some days, Jesus says, didn't you know I'd be in my Father's house? Jesus had a sense of his purpose, of his identity. But I like that he didn't rush it. He was a carpenter. And he didn't really start his earthly ministry, walking into his divine purpose, until his late 20s, early 30s. He was comfortable with God's pace. And sometimes when we have a brand new beginning, this is a lesson for starting, I want us to be careful that we don't just think, oh, we got to do everything. You know, hit the gym now and lose 20 pounds. But rather that we go with God's pacing. And that we have some settledness in our heart with the plan and the pacing and the timing that God has for us. Jesus didn't try to force something before God's divine planning. I look at Moses and he's like, you know, I screwed up, but he didn't say I'm not a screw up. I messed up, but it doesn't mean that God can't give me a fresh start. And then with Jacob, is there anything in the past that poisons or pollutes the start that you have today in this year? So these are some good lessons, things to think about for starting and having a successful start, beginning of a brand new year. Happy New Year, by the way. Thank you so much for subscribing. Of course, hit the little notification bell right there. I'll keep you posted when we put up new content. Here's a question. Here's a question for you to answer and think about this. Put in the comments. Do you make New Year's resolutions? Why or why not? I'm not asking you what that might be. I'm asking you if. Some people don't make them, some people do. What do you do and why? Why do you make them and why don't you make them? Finally, woo, we're waiting for this fantastic joke. What are scientists' favorite dog breeds? What's a favorite dog breed for a scientist? Labs. Stupid, but next week will be better. Thank you.